It's a pleasure to be here today in this Congress of Patients of Respiratory Diseases, discussing precision, personalized, individualized medicine. This is coming from Chicago. It's a pleasure to be in Madrid. Diseases actually occur because of certain circumstances. For example, affected by behavior, such as what we can see here in the slide, by infections, by the environment, which increasingly is becoming important, and of course also by genetics. As we practice medicine currently, one can say that is a medicine that one size fits all, which is probably not what we need and what is embraced by what we call precision, individualized or personalized medicine. Medicine, since the start of humanity, we have medicine and practitioners of medicine and patients that suffer from diseases. And I would start with describing the period of incidental discoveries, which I think occurred up to 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And I would like to start with the discovery of penicillin, which was actually discovered in the laboratory of Dr. Fleming, who observed in a Petri dish that if he had a culture of bacteria, that this culture was contaminated by a fungi. This occurs all the time in the laboratory, and usually we discard this Petri dish. But what he observed that there was a halo by the fungal infection, and this halo inhibited the growth of bacteria. Focusing on that, they found that the fungus of penicillium was able to inhibit the growth of bacteria. And in October of 1928, that was discovered serendipitously. And then in 1945, in conjunction with the pharmaceutical industry, it was developed and began to be used in patients. It was a revolution, truly, because before penicillin and antibiotics were discovered, if somebody had a serious infection, 75% of those patients would die. What is important to notice in all this is that also now that we have antibiotics that don't do the function, or bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, if somebody has a serious infection, 75% of those patients would die. And why is that? So we have, on the one hand, the discovery of antibiotics, and on the other hand, now the overuse of antibiotics, especially in the production of animals, where probably 90% of the antibiotics are used. There is development of resistance, and therefore also some of the infections that are not sensitive to the antibiotics, we go back to very high mortality. So actually, with the discovery and how we use it is as important, so we can continue to take benefit of the discoveries that happened. So I mentioned that because there's some also ethical considerations, because once penicillin was discovered, researchers have used it by actually in vulnerable population, infecting patients, for example, in prisons, and then to a portion of them giving antibiotics and to others not. So each discovery has also a site that needs to be regulated, understood, and legislated so it's used correctly. Then, from the 70s on, there was a period in medicine that was we call the high throughput screening of chemical compounds, and that is how we, or Akira Kendo, discovered statins. And statins are lifesavers for those patients or people that have high cholesterol, and actually probably most people in the developed world, about 50, are on statin, and it has been improving the quality of patients that have high cholesterol and are at risk of heart diseases. And now we move into the current era, or the era of personalized precision or individualized, or what I will call today iMedicine. And in 2001, when the DNA was sequenced, we, in this cover of Time, it was described that we will have drugs of the future where amazing new medicines will be released and will treat most diseases. And so let's focus a little bit on this part. First of all, the cost of genome, when it was first sequenced, to sequence one genome cost $3 billion. Right now, the cost of the genome is slightly above, probably $1,500, and in 5 years it will cost, like any almost other blood test, close to $100. And what are we going to do with that? And how are we going to analyze it? Well, the discovery or the sequencing of the genome has actually revolutionized several aspects of medicine. For example, now a lot of cancers we can sequence and know that some cancers are genetic, have mutations in the genome, and we actually can affect that if there is an actionable mutation. I wanted to also point out two other aspects. For example, once we can sequence the genome or sequence SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, then companies, private companies, such as 23andMe and others, Legacy and so on, I'm not advertising any of those at this point, they are bypassing the physician and can go directly to the consumer, and they will inform through their analysis that you can learn about yourself and from where you're coming or your ancestry, but also some of the possibly predisposition or changes, mutations that can predispose a patient to diseases. And there was different issues and concerns with FDA, and this test was put on hold, but now newer legislation allows it to be marketed in the United States, not in Europe. And what happened is the following, that for those people that have used, paid the $100 or $200 to get the information, what did they do? The majority of them, almost 60%, didn't do anything. It was an informative issue. And some of them made some changes. For example, those that have learned that they have predisposition to hypertension or diabetes had changed their dietary patterns Some people took up on more exercise. Some started with supplements and non-prescription drugs and so on and so on. But 60% didn't do anything about that. So this is an example where medicine also is moving, is that the patient directly, by learning some aspects about their predisposition to diseases, will take action and not wait or not discuss with the doctor, and that has some implications for their health and disease. But let's focus on that. If almost 70 years ago, the population in the world was 2.6 billion people, we have tripled in the last 70 years the population. So if you think about it in drugs and so on, in those 70 years, we have tripled the population, and yet what is the implications for medicine? Will medicine be again, or will continue to be, a relationship, a one-on-one relationship, or they will be need or of other means? So for example, some people already are investing in those possibilities, or countries such as China that have sometimes hospitals that have 50,000 patients, or also not the ability to see every patient by a subspecialist and so on. So companies such as Google and Amazon and others, and again I'm not advertising, are focusing more into how to deliver medicine in different ways. So for example, having a smart band that will measure temperature, blood pressure, glucose, and level of activity, levels of sleep, would be able to be sent to the physician or to the practitioner to help discover or to help to manage some of the diseases, or even preventative of how patients respond. So this new ability of having a new technology allows and will allow to medicine delivery to change. So let me give you an example, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So for example, if somebody has cystic fibrosis, so males are unfertile, but females can have children. Of course, living with cystic fibrosis, for example, for this audience of patients with lung diseases, it's a terrible disease. It's a disease where 50 years ago, patients would die in their teens. Now patients live up to 60 years, some of them go through lung transplant, but if you could avoid your child to have cystic fibrosis, everybody probably would agree that if there is a pre-implantation, so if you have an in vitro fertilization with an egg that doesn't carry cystic fibrosis, ethically we could agree that that would be probably reasonable. The same thing somebody can say with breast cancer, right? So for example, I will give you an example. If there is a patient that is 40 years old, that she learned that she had a breast cancer mutation, one of them, of the BRCA gene or others, and she decides to have a double mastectomy. And then she learns, also she knows, that her aunt died when she was 50, her mother died when she was 45, and she at the age of 40, by having that mutation, decides to, and have breast cancers, decides to go to aggressive therapy. And yet she has a 19-year-old daughter. And she decides, at this point, she says, well, should I tell my daughter that is now going to the university, to college, that I have that mutation, she may have it. And she decides not to tell her because she doesn't want to influence her or change how the daughter, not to worry the daughter. And then she learns that there is some penetrance or more severe disease in younger people. And after 2 years, while the daughter is already in the middle of college, in the university, she decides to tell her. The daughter takes the test, and she also has now the mutation, meaning that she has a high probability to have breast cancer. But at this stage, the daughter has a boyfriend, and they're serious, and they are thinking about to get married. Should she tell that boyfriend that she carries that mutation or not? So learning about some of the genetic aspects also has some ethical issues, that how do we deal with that, and to whom does she tell? Because if, for example, insurance companies in certain cases will learn that she has that mutation, would she be insurable? Will she have healthcare insurance? Does the boyfriend, does he need to know or deserves to know? What I'm trying to say that there is also those ethical issues that need to be discussed not only by scientists that do the discoveries, but also by society, by clergy, by politicians, by law, by the community itself. And yet also, I want to touch upon the last aspect in this slide. It's about surrogate. There are a lot of families that cannot conceive. And in vitro fertilization has been a tool used already, for which the Nobel Prize was given, and for the last 40 years. And in some, I don't know how it is exactly in Spain, but in some states, in some countries, a couple that cannot have a child, but yet have their eggs, the eggs of the wife or the partner, fertilized and implanted in somebody else, that it's a surrogate and carries that baby. Well, somebody can say, well, if they cannot do it because they have impediments, probably if they have $30,000, or if the society can allow for having $30,000 or whatever it costs to finance that, that would be acceptable. And yet, now we know that many film actresses and other people, that they don't want to have the burden of caring, of pregnancy and carrying a baby, have surrogates and somebody else will carry the child, so they don't go through that burden, and it's an economical aspect of it. So what I'm trying to say is that every advance in science has also implications in society, and in general, the legislature or the conversation that need to be having by also groups of patients lag a little bit in time and need to be discussed. Finally, I want to discuss CRISPR. And CRISPR is the ability of edit the genome. So for example, if somebody has lung cancer or other cancers, and you could modify that mutations, while it happens, somebody will say that, or we would actually develop that so that patient can be helped. And yet, we now know that Dr. He Jiangzhu deleted CCR gene in babies, and that already happened in Shenzhen in China to prevent HIV infection in babies. But he did it probably not in a very ethical way and was just fired because those two babies, we don't know what the consequences will be. And some people already saying that they probably will live much shorter life than that. So we have now the most powerful tool of altering the gene. For example, some people would say, well, maybe we should edit the genome or edit so somebody will be taller, somebody will be able to play like Sergio Ramos or Ronaldo, or be as tall as Michael and played basketball like Michael Jordan, or be as smarter. What are the ethical considerations of that? And yet another point is, at least in the United States and most developed countries, we think that we need to inform the patient, and the patient has the right to know what disease does he have. Well, in this study, in the American Journal of Psychiatry, there was a study that they tested for the epsilon-4 gene, which predicts a high likelihood of Alzheimer's disease. And what those investigators did is some of those patients that have this mutation, they actually told them that they have it, and to another group, they didn't tell that they have it, that mutation. And curiously, they found that a year later, those that were told that they have that mutation actually had developed had more symptoms of Alzheimer's than the ones that were not told, which again brings the same question with breast cancer that I brought up before, also to this question: should we really, the patients, should they know if that actually will make them feel worse? What I'm trying to say is that we need to have those conversations to understand how the scientific developments impact human disease. Another aspect. This is a study that was done in London, that if you actually go into I think that they call it the tube or the public transportation, in this station, the expected life expectancy is 78.5 years. And yet, a few miles later, if you step down from that, the expected life expectancy is 5 years less. So it's not only genetics, it's not only our behavior, it's also where you live. In Chicago, this month, it has been published that in a distance of 10 kilometers, if you live in actually the neighborhood where my hospital is, Northwestern University Hospital, the life expectancy is approximately 90 years, whereas 10 kilometers to the south, the expectancy is 60 years, 30 years of difference of expectancy. Why? Well, violence, city issues. Focusing a little bit on patients with lung diseases, we have made significant advances in all these diseases, in asthma, by combining medicine, by understanding some of the genetic aspects. In COPD, which is also affects a huge proportion in patients here in Spain. Somebody would say between 6 and 8% of patients here have chronic obstructive lung diseases. Cystic fibrosis, we know we have channel modifications which can change completely the aspects of diseases. Lung cancer, where we were very nihilistic a few years ago, now we have life-altering medications that can modulate the response of receptors and therefore improve the life of these patients. And also some diseases in pulmonary fibrosis that the pharmaceutical industry has been also instrumental in developing. somebody will say that with all these advances, still, and this is in an article that was published in Nature, that the best buys in the world is to having some aspects, such as, for example, modulating alcohol, diet and physical activity, and also, stopping some of the things like smoking, etc. So still, we need to prevent and to treat diseases. We are utilizing high technology, and still some of the basic behavioral things that we learn through epidemiology are probably very important to implement. So with that, I'm going to finish by defining a little bit better what is personalized precision or individualized or eye medicine, by describing that this I would include, Leroy Hood defined that as the 4 Ps. I can propose here 5 Ps. One is predictive. And predictive is that if you know that you have certain mutations, for example, like for BRCA or predisposition to diabetes, then you can predict that that disease will occur, and of course you can take action. So you can take something what's called preventative. What is preventative? Well, now we do preventative, what Paul Ehrlich has described already from the Hospital Charité more than 100 years ago, that we have vaccination. We can prevent certain diseases, and yet we have doubters for that. Or if we have predisposition for diabetes, we can exercise or not eat certain foods. The other aspect is participatory, which is to inform the patient, and the patients will participate in the decision what is best for them, so they know it, and therefore design what is personalized or precision medicine for that patient. And yet I will argue, from what you have seen, what happens in the study in London and Chicago, that there is also programmatic. If we have food deserts, and we cannot acquire healthy food, or we have endemic violence, and we can modulate that as a society, we can probably also improve medicine. Thank you very much for your attention.